Hi everybody, it's Stuart Broadley here from the EIC and welcome to another EIC Insight Energy podcast. I'm here with Dominic Watson from the Environmental Defence Fund. Hi Dominic, how are you? Welcome to the EIC office here in London in a sweltering hot day.
Hey Stuart, great to be here.
Did you bring the hot weather from New York City with you?
Oh, it's a little hotter there than it is here, so.
We're complaining here that it's too hot.
Exactly.
We need to stop complaining. But we are going to complain about methane today. So thank you so much for coming over. Of course, we met at the Libya Energy Forum, which was a London event earlier in 2026. So you are Director Energy Transition for Environmental Defence Fund, and perhaps I'll just give a bit of a summary of what the Environmental Defence Fund is. Started up in 1967, it is a global non-profit organisation that tackles climate change, the greatest challenge of our time, which I think we'd all agree to. It is a bold, game-changing solution that is trying to put people at the centre of everything that we all do. And that's kind of the purpose statement for Environmental Defence Fund. Goals: stabilise the climate, strengthen people and nature's ability to thrive, and support people's health. Massive membership and supporters, more than 3.5 million individuals and companies that are supporting the organisation, including 1,000 scientists, economists, policy experts, legal experts and others. And active currently in more than 30 countries around the world. So today we're going to focus on the thing that's very close to your heart, which is reducing methane emissions. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this podcast. Lovely to see you again. And yeah, let's start with that. Let's dig into methane. Why methane? Why is it so important?
Why methane emissions when there's so much focus and discussion on carbon dioxide? I'll put forward a few reasons why methane's an incredibly important issue to focus on from a climate perspective, from, as we'll get into, a business perspective. But I think the place to start is just by pointing out that methane emissions is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. It's about 80 times more powerful than CO2 over the first 20 years of its lifetime in the atmosphere. And because of that fact, methane emissions is contributing to about a third of all of the climate warming that we're seeing today. And there's a number of different sources. There are natural sources. Wetlands is one of the biggest ones. There's a number of man-made sources as well. And today, what we'll focus on and what my issue area is methane emissions from the oil and gas industry, which is, of course, not the only man-made source. You also get methane emissions from coal mines, from agriculture, particularly from livestock. But the oil and gas industry presents perhaps the greatest opportunity for emissions reductions because loss of methane emissions from the oil and gas industry is loss of valuable product. Every ton of methane emissions that's leaked into the atmosphere from the oil and gas industry is natural gas. They could have been captured, could have been sold to a customer, could have been put to beneficial use, could have generated revenue.
I love there's a stat that you gave me last time I saw you, which was all the world's methane flared and vented in a year adds up to the same as all the gas that passed through the Strait of Hormuz in 2025. Is that the stat?
If you look at global numbers of how much the industry is losing per year, including methane emissions, and you add up all the natural gas lost to flaring, so when natural gas is burned as a waste product, usually on site, in upstream operations, midstream operations, you get, not to be exact about it, but somewhere between 3 to 5% of global natural gas loss annually. And that is, of course, a really significant number. And to put it in context, exactly as you were saying, the IEA estimates that using existing technology, we could recover 100 BCM of gas from methane leakage, and we could recover 100 BCM of gas from flaring and bring that to market. Gas that flowed through the Strait of Hormuz in 2025 was 100. So nearly double all of the gas that flowed through the Strait of Hormuz in 2025 is not just lost to the atmosphere, but could be recovered using existing technologies and brought to market.
Right. So definitely one of the things we should talk about. It sounds so stupid, doesn't it? Because this is valuable wealth generating gas that there is simple technology out there to ensure the leakage is reduced or eliminated and the flaring is reduced or eliminated. So we'll definitely get into that. Just again, you were talking there about in terms of the various emitters of methane, and some are natural and some are human caused. It's actually 60% or more of the methane emissions that are human caused. I wasn't aware it was that high. The single biggest is agriculture, but then, as you say, next is fossil fuels.
Yeah, absolutely. So the emissions we focus on are, of course, the man-made ones, because those are the ones that are changing our climate. Those are the ones that are being added to the atmosphere at rates that are leading to the warming that we're seeing today. And the reason that the Environmental Defense Fund has had such a focus on the oil and gas industry is because of this really significant win-win opportunity here, that in capturing methane emissions, we could have material impact on our climate. But of all of the climate solutions we have available to us today, it's really one of the cheapest that we could deliver immediate warming reductions. Let me just put some of the climate facts into context here. According to the IPCC and the IEA, rapidly addressing methane emissions is fundamental to being able to achieve any net zero pathway. And what they state very clearly is that if we want to achieve anywhere near a Paris-aligned target, so say 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, we're going to have to tackle both methane emissions and carbon dioxide. That means no matter what scenario we have for energy systems going forward, if we want to have a stable climate and avoid the worst impacts of climate change, that means going after methane emissions as well as carbon dioxide. So just to put some numbers on it, there's a study done by EDF where if we were to implement all of the known solutions to methane emissions across the economy, and about half of those would come at no net cost. So the value of the captured methane emissions, the captured gas would pay for whatever the cost would be of mitigating those emissions. So if we were to implement all of those known solutions, we could slow the rate of warming by about 30%. And that would shave about 1/4 of a degree off of global warming by the middle of the century, and then 1/2 degree off of warming by the end of the century. So in terms of the climate, it really is significant numbers.
What's really interesting about why methane is so important is as you talked about, the potency. And it's also kind of time sensitive, because over a shorter period of time, like 10 to 20 years, then methane is deemed to be 86 times more potent than CO2 in terms of having an impact on the atmosphere. But actually over time, that does dilute, but it's still significantly more potent than CO2. Over a 100-year period, it's 20, 80, 30 times more potent than CO2. So it doesn't really matter to be, whether you're looking at it over 20 or 100 years, it's so much more potent.
Yeah, and I think a big part of why methane emissions has been undervalued in the climate conversation here is exactly that, is that we're taking a short-term impact over 20 years and measuring it over 100 years, which quite clearly, and there's arguments on both sides here, but I would say quite clearly, to some degree, undervalues the impact of methane emissions given the short-term warming impact here. The way to think about it is that carbon dioxide will ultimately determine the ultimate rate of warming that the planet is going to see. Methane emissions is going to determine how fast we get there. So it's going to determine the warming impact that we see over our lifetimes. That also means if we start tackling methane emissions now, that we're going to be able to see outcomes from that work over our lifetimes.
Brilliant. So tackling methane emissions, the reason we met in London was at the Libya Energy Forum. So the National Oil Company of Libya is a brilliant example of an organization which has aged oil and gas infrastructure. Obviously, it's come through a period of conflict, now emerging from that, wanting to participate in the world's oil and gas markets again, starting to make investments in new facilities, but most importantly wants to get more oil and gas out of its existing infrastructure. And one of the brilliant ways to do that, of course, is to have less leakage and less flaring. So that's kind of a brilliant segue into how I met you at that event. If you're enjoying this podcast and think you have an inspiring story to tell, contact me, Stuart Broadley, directly, as I would love to do a sea-level podcast with you too. EIC is proud to be the UK's largest membership energy trade association and the 5th largest in the world. We are unique around the world for 3 reasons. We are truly energy agnostic, believing all energy technologies are vital to delivering energy security, affordability, and a just transition. We are the only energy trade association anywhere in the world that offers a truly in-house one-stop shop for market intelligence, networks, and events to help our members export, diversify, and grow. And we are proud to be the voice of the energy supply chain, advocating for the 5 golden rules of a healthy energy supply chain. More details on EIC membership, the 5 golden rules, details about doing a future podcast with me, and how to contact us about anything else are in the description for this podcast. So let's talk about these kind of real-world examples. How should a company approach if it has aged infrastructure and perhaps financing problems? Why would they do leak reduction first if there are other ways to improve production? How do we make it financially the no-brainer outcome that they would pursue?
Let me just start by addressing, I think, a question I would have, which is why would an environmental group be at an oil and gas forum for Libya? You might think this is an unlikely place for an environmental group to be, but I think if we look at the opportunity for Libya in terms of emissions reductions, it really is quite significant. So Libya, as you said, is looking to export more of its oil and gas. The European Union has recently put in place emissions regulations that would, over time, put in place reporting requirements and then eventually an import standard for supply chain emissions of methane emissions. So that would mean that all the natural gas that's imported into the European Union from Libya, from all parts of the world that export into the European market, would have to demonstrate using really high quality data that they're meeting a certain intensity threshold along the supply chain in terms of methane emissions. The typical standard in the industry is around 0.2%. So near zero essentially is, I think, the ultimate goal of where the regulation might trend to. In addition to this, the Libyan National Oil Company has pretty significant joint venture partnerships with a number of major international oil companies. So ConocoPhillips, Total, Eni, just to name a few. And these are companies that themselves have set methane emissions targets. They all have this industry standard target of 0.2% or around there. Some kind of near zero target is typically what they're called. And in order for them to be able to achieve their targets, they need their joint venture partners like Libya NOC to be able to take action on starting to measure their emissions and reduce their emissions. And because of these factors, because of other factors, that's where we've seen the really promising work that the Libyan National Oil Company and the journey that they've started on, and where a group like EDF would hope to further encourage that progress. So what we've seen from the Libyan National Oil Company, as you said, is they have pretty old infrastructure. The incentives are now in place for them to be able to start reducing emissions, but it's challenging, right? This requires capital expenditure. This requires operational expenditure.
So the reason Libya is getting excited right now about a fast-growing demand for more oil and gas from Europe is because of the world waking up to the fact that the Strait of Hormuz may now never operate as it used to. It's hopefully going to be open on a long-term basis, but always with that doubt now about it could close at any point. We've all learned that now. So I think many East Mediterranean and Northern African countries are now of the view, which is they would be a far more secure way of selling oil and gas into Europe. So is that the business case? That's now moved from, they don't have a revenue stream for that wasted gas. So therefore spending money to not flare it is to them not a good business case. Now, not only do they have more demand for the oil and gas they have, but also they have to have a low emission certified oil and gas to meet the oil and gas requirements. So now they have to show that they have actions in place to progressively improve their emission reduction.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The Libyans have seen that, as you said, the world is waking up to demands for companies to be able to address methane emissions, to be able to show that they're addressing methane emissions. And so what they've done is they've started to set targets, which is great, and they've started to join various frameworks and commitments around methane emissions. So there's one that recently the Libyan National Oil Company joined called the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, which goes by OGMP, which is essentially a reporting framework. It covers about 40% of global oil and gas production. And by joining that framework, the Libyan National Oil Company is committed to improving its data quality over time. So they have to, instead of relying on what the industry has relied on for a number of years, which is Excel spreadsheets essentially, and emissions factors, the company is going to have to go out and directly measure its emissions in order to have an understanding of where its emissions are coming from so it can tackle them. So that's one major step that they've taken. Just a few weeks ago, they joined the World Bank's Zero Routine Flaring initiative, and so I've committed to reducing emissions. And now the commitments are really promising and are a bright spot, especially for a company like Libya in terms of the picture of new commitments from the oil and gas industry. But now the real work of going about and reducing emissions is going to have to happen for Libya. And that involves capital expenditures, that involves operational expenditures. And even if, as we said, a lot of this is cost effective and quite cheap, in many cases can generate returns, you need to be able to allocate capital to the emissions reduction projects in order to be able to see the methane emissions actually come out.
So now we get to the nub of the matter, which is you're a cash-strapped but fast developing and very ambitious oil company in a market where you don't have easy ways of raising capital, of which, say, the National Oil Company Libya would be one of those. But they now have a market opportunity. They now have a technical challenge they want to fix, of which there are plenty of supply chain companies out there that can say, we know how to reduce your emission, reduce your flaring. And yet it's not easy, is it? They're not able to get companies to come into the country like Libya and support that ambition because predominantly they fear, those supply chain companies, they're not going to get paid. So then it becomes a financing challenge more than a technical challenge, more than a demand challenge. So what's the role of the Environmental Defense Fund in joining the dots for that?
Fundamentally, when we look at the core of this challenge within an oil company or an oil and gas company or a gas company is that even if a lot of methane emissions reductions are cost effective, even if there's many projects that are going to generate a return within an oil and gas company, capital for those emissions projects is always going to compete against other potential uses for that capital. And within an oil and gas company, there's often quite lucrative ways to be able to use that capital. Hurdle rates are generally quite high. And what the Environmental Defense Fund aims to do is to be able to find ways to level out the incentives and give those emissions reduction projects the priority and the consideration that they would need to rise to the top of the pile so that oil and gas companies can be able to deploy capital towards those emissions reduction projects. So that can happen in the very typical ways that corporate sustainability initiatives or emissions reductions initiatives or safety initiatives might be prioritized, where there's a commitment from the top down. The CEO, whoever leads the organization, executives decide that this is no longer acceptable. This is no longer a good way of doing business, and sets a target that flows down through the company. Ideally, that's incentivized in pay packages and is structurally integrated into how companies go about addressing this challenge. That essentially aims to create behavioral changes within the organization where addressing this problem is thought of as part of every person's role, and that resources are appropriately allocated to addressing the emissions, even when it might not be the most lucrative use of capital. It's determined that the benefits across the organization are sufficient that it's worth the investment here.
Libya is one of those markets which is now really focusing on this, but is still now working on how to raise the capital and how to attract the supply chain. And we hope to support them over the next couple of years as they make that journey. Do you have examples right now of other projects that have gone through this process and you're able to sort of share a little bit of the learning of what was the benefit, what was the outcome, what were the challenges?
One example that's industry-wide, that's not just one company, is how the oil and gas industry addresses safety risk or oil spills, where the only acceptable number of safety incidents or of oil spills is 0. And I think we've seen some of that translate into methane emissions, where a number of companies, when they're setting targets, as I mentioned, set near 0 targets, where the idea is we're going to aim for 0. We may not always hit 0, but we will do our best to hit 0 emission. There's one organization that I think...
This would be a famous international oil company.
A famous international oil company that made significant strides on methane emissions over the past 5 to 10 years, starting with a CEO-led commitment where the executive from this organization decided that there was enough reputational damage that was happening. There was enough investor pressure on the organization to be able to get a handle on this issue. There were enough external factors, enough pressure from groups like the Environmental Defense Fund that this was a problem that could be solved, could be cost effective, and needed to go away because the pressure was ultimately too great. I think that's just the start of the story. What we've seen since with this organization is that in terms of tackling this issue, yes, the reputational headlines have got away, and a lot of the initial factors that might have driven the organization to focus on this have been solved. But since, they've seen tremendous benefit across the organization. So first of all, in integrating methane emissions into integrating methane management into how they operate, they've seen safety improvements. In finding ways to be able to address methane emissions, they've reduced the amount of windshield time their operational staff might have in terms of going out and driving to sites and checking for methane emissions.
It still seems amazing to me that companies are still in this pretty early phase of, from a flaring and just leak management process, that they still regard a lot of that as they have no revenue opportunity, so therefore they don't try that hard to rescue that lost gas. And it needs the business opportunity to then put that logic, which is, okay, now as we talked about with the National Oil Company Libya example, there's a European market opportunity, but it requires low emissions and transparency around that. So now they invest in it. And they're just now looking for supply chain companies to come with the money to help them do it. But the company we're talking about now, which is a major international oil company, they don't have that problem. They have loads of cash. And yet they're prioritizing other ways to grow the business. And this must be frustrating for you, a climate action group like yours. But in the end, I still don't understand them. Surely to me, as I have a bit of a rant about this, a company that's the safest company is also the one that has the most reliable equipment, that needs the least maintenance for that equipment, it produces the most effectively and efficiently. And that also means that it therefore has the lowest emissions. That's just normal business practical sense. And yet what your experience is, still so many companies would say actually reducing flaring, reducing leakage isn't always a business case that is worth pursuing.
I think that's exactly right. And I think a lot of those companies may not know how much methane emissions they're emitting, how much gas they're losing, or even sometimes how much they're flaring in exact numbers. And what the process of addressing methane emissions does for a company is to get a better understanding of their operational sites, of their equipment, of the effectiveness of their oil and gas operations. In the early days of addressing methane emissions, we heard anecdotes from oil and gas companies that were looking to build a program of regularly monitoring all of their assets and operations, but they didn't have integrated platforms to be able to know where all of their well sites were.
And if you can't measure something, you're not going to get the outcome you want.
Right. These companies had that information distributed to operational staff who individually knew where all of the sites were, but there was no one platform to be able to do so. So it was a process of, I think some of these companies eventually built out apps that were easy for operational staff to be able to have on iPads or phones in the field to be able to go out and check these sites for emissions. And I think the story is similar as companies have integrated methane management into their operations, where by going out and measuring emissions, by going out and understanding where the emissions are coming from, they can really have an understanding of their sources and going out and tackling them. And what these companies have found is that, exactly as you said, by addressing these emissions, by understanding which parts of their operations are functioning in the way that they were designed to, and which might not be or might be outdated, might need replacement, is that they've found that they have higher uptime with a lot of their operations, that they're of course able to capture more revenue as they capture methane and flaring emissions, and that in many cases that they have reduced safety incidents, or that they're able to reduce the risk exposure of their operational staff from being able to address methane emissions.
But you're holding everybody to account, rightly so as to say it's not happening fast enough. There's a lot more that needs to be done. So I guess that leads me to my last question, which is, so what do you hope for the future? If we sort of put a window of 5 years into the future.
What the past 5 to 10 years have been about is around increasing awareness, where 10 years ago, where EDF and other similar groups were starting to do scientific studies around methane emissions from the oil and gas industry, and all of a sudden finding a lot more methane emissions than was anticipated from the industry. We've since seen the industry understand the importance of this challenge. We've seen their investors understand the importance and the value of having companies address methane emissions. We've seen markets like the EU start to take steps towards addressing imports of gas and upstream methane emissions. And all of that has led to recognition of the problem in the forms of targets, where we now have around 40 to 50% of the oil and gas industry that's covered by a near zero target of some kind. And that other 50%, there's a number of producing countries, let's say, that are outside of the international order and are quite unlikely to set any kind of meaningful target in the near future. So say Russia, Iran, Venezuela, though maybe those might change, who knows. And so I think that progress on target setting has been really promising and is, of course, the place to start. What we need to see more of is implementation, where what the Environmental Defense Fund has been advocating for is that companies improve their disclosures. So that means going out, measuring your emissions, and then showing your work through frameworks like the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, which is run by the United Nations and which has the backing of which has membership from a broad swath of the oil and gas industry. That means going out and actually putting capital towards the problem and disclosing those capital and operational expenditures. That means going out and disclosing plans for how companies are going to be able to address methane emissions and showing not just a commitment, but a roadmap to how companies are address it. We've seen a number of leading operators go out and start to disclose those plans, but of the companies that have set targets, it's still a relatively small minority of companies.
Yeah. I mean, the innovation, of course, has been satellite monitoring of emissions that must have made a huge difference to an organization like yours and be able to hold companies to account. Well, I hope that we can do this again in perhaps 5 years' time, and then we'll be talking less about the transparency and the awareness and more about delivery and action, perhaps at the next Libya Energy Forum, when perhaps then they'll be fully funded and will be main supplier of gas to Europe. Who knows?
Who knows? I hope I'll be out of a job in 5 years' time, but if not, we can come back and see where we're at.
Are you an optimist?
I think of all of the challenges that we have in front of us, this is one that over the next 5 to 10 years, I believe the industry can and will be able to solve. It's just a question of how quickly.
I'm an optimist too, but I think you will still be in a job in the next 5 years, unfortunately. But hey, we all need a job, right?
That's right.
Dominic, thank you so much. Lovely to see you. And enjoy the heat.
Thank you very much, Stuart.
Thanks. Well, that's our show for today. A huge shout out to Samara, Lucas and Joao and the rest of our incredible team behind the scenes. This show truly wouldn't happen without them. If you enjoyed this podcast, it would mean the world if you'd hit that follow button. Give a 5-star rating or leave a review. It's the best way to help us keep doing what we love. And as a thank you, I'll leave you with my favourite 5-word joke. Love wind power. Big fan.